Thank you for inviting me. My name, as you've heard, is Brian Waters. I'm a chartered civil engineer, and I live by the fact that civil engineering provides the infrastructure for civilized living. At least that's our story, and we're sticking by it. Most of my career has been in maritime work, from long sea outfalls and intakes, harbours and marinas, and coastal defence engineering. I've also done quite a lot of work with the RNLI, for whom I have an enormous admiration. I have covered the UK coast from St Mary's in the Isles of Scilly in the south to Lerwick in the Shetlands in the north. I've been fortunate to have been involved in overseas projects, ranging from Hong Kong, where we as a whole family lived for 2 years, although that wasn't maritime work, but also in Lebanon, Turkey, Italy, Ivory Coast, Egypt and Australia. It was therefore remarkable that I was able to complete my full-time working with a major scheme here in Eastbourne, where I have actually lived here for more than 40 years, and I hope to be accepted soon. An apology, I wrote an article for the Observer magazine for the Society, so obviously there's going to be some repetition if you've read that already. So tonight, I propose to cover the background to the Coast Protection Scheme, which was completed, astonishingly enough, 22 years ago, together with a DVD showing some of the construction. However, a little local history. When the 7th Duke of Devonshire decided to build a seaside resort in the 1850s to rival the Prince Regent's Brighthelmstone, or Brighton as we now know it, he had a number of advantages. The coastline was undeveloped, apart from the 2 Napoleonic fortifications at Wish Tower and the Redoubt, which were both finished, I think, by 1810, 1812. And there were very small developments at the base of the cliff at Holywell, which is long since gone, and also at Sea Houses, which is near where the pier is now. He actually, of course, had a big advantage, was owned a lot, if not the majority of the land, and he had the wealth and the foresight to put in necessary infrastructure. He was able, under those circumstances, to appoint some very able professionals, and there was nobody to challenge his scheme, nor to query the Victorian view that nature could be tamed by man. We nowadays know only too well that we have to work with nature, not against it. However, the Duke was able to instruct his agent, one George Wallace, to ride a promenade, initially at the base of the cliffs at Holywell, with a view to extending it across the frontage. Wallace, and we don't know if he had any qualms about it, built a sea wall behind which he could infill and then put the walkway on the top of it behind the wall. However, it was very quickly found that storm waves hitting the wall caused localized lowering of the shingle as the disturbed material washed away from west to east. So Wallace adopted the traditional method of controlling beach drift by building groins, initially at Holywell, but found that each section of each group of groins he built, there was even more erosion on the lee side. He was thus forced into continuing the groin construction, eventually reaching all the way to Langney Point, and this was completed in 1900, although Wallace himself actually died in 1895. So now we'll leave the history and jump ahead to the 1980s, where by then responsibility of the coast protection had passed to the Borough Council with their professional staff and direct labour groups, but a huge pressure on financial resources. The result was that maintenance suffered. The groins were in a dilapidated state, damaged by rot, insect attack and physical loads. And there are some photographs up on the table here in front you might like to look at later. On the left-hand side, it shows a picture of what some of the groins did, and they also will be shown on the DVD. Such was the loss of shingle, as these groins didn't work anymore, that the foundations of the sea wall were visible at places, and after the 1987 storm event, there was a 9-metre drop from the promenade to the beach at Holywell. Storm waves also further along the coast, along Marine Parade, threw stones up onto the road, frequently closing it under storm conditions and also damaging the hotels behind. As I mentioned, as I understand, the council were petitioning the government ministry involved, that was MAF, or the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, for extra funding, but were eventually told by that ministry to get expert help. And MAF had provided a short list of leading consultants, of which my firm was one. We were all interviewed, and in due course my firm was selected. So having put the bid together and the nucleus of a team, I felt it very much as my job, and thus was even more privileged to see the project through to completion in 2000. However, it's very much a team event. Overall, I had 40 people worked on the team over the years: civil engineers, environmental scientists, computer analysts, surveyors, administrators, and specialist site staff when we came to the construction. Now, you will, I hope, accept the truism that unless one understands the problem, one is unlikely to be able to suggest a solution, especially an economic one. So, why was the beach on our frontage so mobile? Well, of course, we all live here. We can know that there have been historic changes, and noticeably at Pevensey, of course, once a Cinque Port, the castle where the outer wall was built by the Romans on the seashore, and it's now half a mile inland. If you'd stood up on the castle in the Middle Ages, you would have seen sailing ships taking shelter behind the castle, which is now a land. And I have, again on the table, an illustration of where the seashore was at that time. And it's also got a line across there where the present foreshore is, and we've marked in the railway stations to give you some idea where the geography is. The huge expanse of the crumbles, apparently also wave-borne shingle, was also evident of the changes that had taken place over the year. I was a little bit alarmed at having to go to the ministry and say, look, what we really need is some money to carry out a very in-depth investigation. But I had a fruitful discussion with the ministry, and to my relief, they agreed to fund a full investigation to be carried out before we were required to suggest a strategy. My team started out with an historic literature search. One contemporary report was startling. I paraphrase, but in part of a violent storm in 1705, it was recorded that the beach at Brighthelmstone was reduced to bare rock. It went on to say that these huge amounts of shingle, which had been washed away from Brighton, had settled out on what they now call Beachy Head. Further storms, presumably less severe, drove this shingle across what was to become the Eastbourne frontage. Now I'm going to divert for just a moment to talk about the interest of I do beg your pardon. It's amazing, the pages get glued together. And the fascination of research on this sort of frontage. Records exist, we found, of a major event on the West Country in 1607. Even I'm not old enough to remember that. Huge waves pushed up the Bristol Channel, and medieval churches in the area have tablets on their walls recording the water reached these very high levels. And I believe something like 2,000 people died, which if you translated that to the population would be the equivalent to about, what, 20,000 today. So was this just a storm event? Well, I've looked at it again, and I have a researcher who is very interesting in doing this sort of work. And we found there was an Australian university who've actually produced a paper suggesting it was a tsunami. Now, the great interest about that is that if it was a tsunami, the energy for that wave formation is called by something that has happened below the surface of the sea, an earthquake or a cliff fall or something like that. But it was recorded by a number of sources that there was a very great storm in 1607. So we began to wonder. But then, going on the analysis of the records, my researcher found that, in fact, in that particular year, it was the highest tide for 100 years. So with that allied with the obviously storm waves that took place, would then account for this unprecedented water level. So whilst on the subject of earthquakes, did you know that in 1821 an earthquake was recorded at Alfriston? It was very minor. It lasted 2 minutes of rumble and just vibration. Returning to our own frontage, Clearly, the reserves of the shingle, which had settled out at Beachy Head, had washed across our frontage. Probably the lot had gone by 1800, which accounts for the Napoleonic structures showing erosion on their lee sides. Our studies concluded that the only feed onto our frontage was longshore drift from the west, and it was reducing in quantity almost year by year. In addition, there were the matters of rising sea levels and possible increased storminess. The very future of Eastbourne as a seaside resort was threatened. The strategy was then thus to remove the danger of storm events from the immediate foreshore, and how best to achieve this. One idea was to actually build offshore rock islands, which has been done in various places in the world, including even in the Mediterranean. Or constructing, one I quite liked at the time, was using rock and imported material to produce some big bays which would stabilise the whole frontage. Or to much increased defences along the foreshore with a large enough shingle bank to absorb all storm waves. The latter was favoured by the client, the district council, in particular by the tourism department, and it also, as it happened, turned out to be the most favourable financially. Thus, the design criteria was finalised. A much larger shingle beach able to dissipate the largest waves, plus a considerable uprating of the size and quality of the control structures, the groins, and also a refurbishment and strengthening of the seawall and the promenade. In addition, we had in mind to improve the appearance of the seafront in the setting of a conservation area, particularly perhaps along Marine Parade, where, as I've mentioned, it would be closed in storm events. And we actually there, because it was too expensive to advance the shingle bank, we've put in a wave wall at the back of the promenade, and of course you then have to have storm gates in it and remember to close them when storms are forecast. Again, you'll see that on the DVD. One other factor necessary was to reduce the effect of such reconstruction on visitors, hotels and seafront services. This necessitated rather more work in the winter months, including in the dark, than was usual. Again, this will be covered then when the contractor talks about closing up for the summer months. Very difficult work in the winter because, of course, you're working tidally, so therefore, if you've got the low tide, that's when you've got to work and it's dark. And it does give me one of my stories. I did agree to meet the contractor's staff down one Friday evening. I think we said 7:30 at the pier steps. It was in December. It was bitterly cold. Even the workmen, they had their yellows on, but they had gloves. If those men are wearing gloves, it is cold. As we stood there talking on the steps, 5 little girls came past, going out, presumably to the nightclub, which was at that time at the end of the pier. I kid you not, the skirts were somewhere right up here. 2 of them had about 6 inches of bare midriff. There wasn't a coat in sight, and they tripped past with their handbags. And they didn't take any notice of those old chaps standing on the steps like that. But after they'd gone past, I think one of the more polite comments was, don't they feel there's something cold? However. So the design, having decided that this is how we were going to deal with it, the designers set to work, and we found we needed 1 million tonnes of shingle, which was imported from licensed areas off the Isle of Wight, to be controlled by 99 much enlarged hardwood groins. The design spacing of these, in our design, well, the design had picked the spacing of it, but in view of the importance of it, we had it rechecked at Hydraulics Research Laboratory in a very nice little scale model, and we found that we'd actually got our spacing exactly right. The seawall encasement and other improvements used 32,000 tonnes of concrete, and 50,000 tonnes of rock armour were used, mainly at Langney Point, between Langney Point and the new harbour arm, but also at the base of the Holywell cliffs. The total cost of this scheme was £31.7 million, for which the council got a 75% grant from the ministry, and also contributions from Southern Water and the Environment Agency, where they had specifically benefited by the new works. The biggest item, of course, was the dredging and the import of all this shingle, which was done as 2 separate contracts, and that would cost just under 14 million. There was a formal opening in 1999 by a government minister, and it's recorded on a plaque which is in front of the Lifeboat Museum, And that plaque itself is mounted on a granite plinth, which we dug up out of the beach, and it's almost certainly a gun platform from a long since gone fortification, and you would have a cannon on it and enable it to turn round for enfilade fire. So we used that to put the plaque on, and it's there now. For me personally, it was a very satisfying job, not least because of the professional working relationship with the ministry, the client, the borough engineer in particular, and our contractors, and with my own team. We're now going to see a DVD of some of the construction, and afterwards, if the chairman permits, I will attempt to deal with any questions. Thank you very much. Over to you. Thank you.
Eastbourne, the Sunshine Coast. Backed by the rolling South Downs and enjoying a mild climate, Eastbourne is a versatile residential location. An ideal conference centre and a popular holiday resort. A playground for young and old. The coast, with its Victorian pier, faces southeast, providing safe shingle beaches for all to enjoy. Unfortunately, Eastbourne is under threat. Not from invading forces, which Eastbourne has quelled in times past, but from another marauding force. Before the storms in 1990, many people would have doubted the possibility of severe floods in Eastbourne. But it happened. This is the sort of storm Eastbourne might expect once in 100 years. Needless to say, there was considerable damage. For 100 years or so, oak groins protected the beach by slowing down and trapping the natural supply of shingle that washed along the shore. In turn, the shingle added protection, breaking the power of the waves as they crashed on the beach and absorbing their energy in the shifting pebbles. But by the end of the 20th century, the natural supply of shingle had drastically diminished. This was in part due to other coastal defence works along the coast. Heavy storms washed a lot away, laying bare the foundations of the sea wall. Had there been a major breach of the defences, up to 1/3 of Eastbourne would have been flooded. Eastbourne Council were very aware of the threat and the need for new coastal protection for the town.
Top of the borough's concerns was to make sure that whatever scheme we actually put in here in Eastbourne was environmentally friendly. We had to look at a completely new solution, and we've done that in conjunction with the ministry responsible, which is the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Foods. The scheme, obviously, in engineering terms, had to be the best that was available and possible, and in economic terms, it had to be the most economic as well. So those were the three criteria that we had to look at. We brought in Hosford de Vivier, who are, in fact, internationally renowned company with regard to coast protection and this type of work.
There is a great deal of design work which goes on before any of these schemes takes place and long before anything appears on the beach. For instance, there are strategy studies, such as this sort of document, and having carried out a strategy study and started detailed design, before the detailed design is turned into a scheme on the ground, we sometimes carry out physical models, and in the case of Eastbourne, parts of the coastline were actually physically modelled in test tanks in hydraulics research at Wallingford. So far as the shingle beach is concerned, we know only too well that the material moves along the beach and can be lost to the system. So we then have to put something in to control the loss of beach, and that's the groin field. But those groins could have been of rock, or maybe even of solid concrete. We elected to use timber, having looked at the shapes of the beach that would be used if we had rock groins.
After much consultation and design studies, it was decided that to maintain the traditional feel of Eastbourne beaches, quantities of shingle would be imported to build larger beaches. Then, to make sure that shingle stayed put, the ageing, damaged oak would be replaced with much larger and stronger timber groins.
Then you come to the timber issue. Eastbourne had traditionally used oak, and in fact Eastbourne Borough Council already had an environmental requirement that imported hardwoods were not used, whether it's for window frames or desks or anything else. So we had to demonstrate to their satisfaction that an imported hardwood for the groins was the right solution, economically, technically, and in environmental terms.
The wood chosen? Greenheart, from the vast forests of Guyana. Forests which have been carefully managed as a renewable resource for over 150 years.
Basically, the Green Lobby will say we're destroying the rainforest. I would say we were harvesting it. And if people can't make any money out of their trees, they're not going to respect them. They're just going to burn them or bulldoze them. The logger and forester is looking for a decent tree so that he can get a good yield from it. And once he extracts that, it opens up the canopy a bit and lets more light in so the younger trees and the smaller trees, the next generation as it were, have a better chance.
How then would the work be undertaken, and when? Eastbourne is a tourist town after all, and no one was going to thank the council for making the beach inaccessible during the summer months.
Basically, we could only work in the winter. We had to close up ranks in the summer, but make sure we had to be finished by Easter, and then start again the following autumn. So those restrictions in terms of winter working, logically everyone says, why do you want to work in the winter? Well, we don't, but because Eastbourne is a tourist town, and it's part of our commitment, customer relations, etc., that obviously we want to make sure we don't upset the apple cart, so to speak.
As the coastal defence develops, it is crucial that we keep everyone informed of what is going on, not just the residents, but also the holiday makers. We do anticipate a great deal of interest in a high-profile scheme such as this. At the moment, we're putting up maps and plans. We've got before and after pictures, and we're hoping to produce information leaflets on a regular basis to let people know what is going on and why it's taking place. And with a bit of luck, everything will work very smoothly and we'll end up with a superb completed plan.
Work started at the eastern end of the town, and one of the first tasks was piling.
Timber piles, they're the things that holds the groin up, and the groin is basically a timber fence, for want of a better word. The piles are the uprights, and the planks run horizontally and are fixed to the piles. Those are driven into the ground with a piling rig. The main challenge is working with nature, not against her, but with her. The tides, the wind, the weather. All of the groins we've constructed, we've had are what are called wet ends, which means you have to construct the outer ends in water, which means the men working on the groin have got either dry or wetsuit on. we have to really time it and try and chase the tide out as we drive piles, and we get chased back in by the tide.
It's been very difficult for the contractors, as you can imagine, working in the sea and near the sea over the winter period. And the contractors have worked well with that, and they've been very, very successful in the way that they've actually carried out these works.
Beyond the Wish Tower there are 24 groins, which are slightly different because we're over into the rock chalk, and we had to excavate trenches and place the posts at set distances and concrete them into a trench, rather like fence posts, but a bit larger.
Due to differential loading on some of the groins, that is, the shingle building up higher on one side of the groin than the other, substantial supports or ties in the form of large oak trunks were required.
On the project in total, I mean, we've used, to give you an idea, there's 94 groins, there's approximately 135 kilometres of planking, that's enough to stretch from here to Heathrow. Fixing the planking, there's 250,000 coach screws, 160,000 bolts, and in total there's 8,300 piles. So that gives you some idea of the size of the contract.
One of the main concerns must be the shingle, the amount being used, nearly 1 million tonnes, and people are concerned as to where it's coming from. Well, it actually is coming from licensed beds off the Isle of Wight. It is brought in by dredger and pumped ashore. These licensed areas are themselves very rigidly controlled by government.
Well, there was one interesting comment that we did receive before the beach was filled in, and of course there was lots and lots of timber piles sticking up in the air, almost a forest of timber piles, and people have been asking why are they there, and that sort of question. And then some time afterwards, when the beach had been backfilled, a person was overheard to say, "Oh, I'm glad to see they've cut all those piles down."
The scheme we have finished up with is an attempt to work with nature rather than against it. For instance, at the Holywell end of the site, that is a site of special scientific interest, and we must not impinge on the Pound area, for instance, which is the area behind the Greensand Reef.
It's in the nature of designers and engineers to understate a problem. The triple SI site contains interesting and unusual plant and animal colonies and several species rare for southeastern England. It is one of the most important marine sites in the region. To safeguard the area, shingle was pumped ashore at a safe distance from the greensand reef and then transported to the beach in front of the reef by a fleet of dumpers. This method avoided fine sand and silt washing into the pound area and damaging the marine life.
One of the funniest stories I've got is we were just closing down for the first summer period, and we had 3 low loaders, machines, lots of activity in the Wish Tower car park. And a bus pulls up, coach, and a chap runs down the stairs, and he says to the foreman, he says, what's going on? He said, where are you going? He said, we're finishing. He said, what do you mean finishing? He said, we're closing for the summer. We can't work in the summer. So he said, I've got a coach load of day trippers here. He said, just come down to see you.
Another important part of the contract was the construction of rock revetments. These would provide protection for low-lying areas at the eastern end of the project, which included the marine treatment works.
In total, there's been 37,000 tonnes of rock delivered. The first 17,000 tonnes was delivered by road, and that was smallish rock, between 1 to 3 tonnes. The last delivery of rock has been 20,000 tonnes, and that's from Norway. It's called a nice granite, and it's from Jelsa. That's been shipped in. That was a 20,000 tonne barge, which had a small transshipping barge, which was actually 10,000 tonnes. And that took approximately 8 days to offload and delivered to the beach at high water. And the rock was offloaded from the small barge by a 75-tonne excavator with a rock grab.
Finally, the old sea wall, over 100 years old, had to be extensively renovated. In the low-lying area to the east of the pier, and at the rear of the promenade, a splash wall was added to prevent shingle being strewn across the road during severe storms.
Well, basically, Eastbourne can look forward to 50 years uninterrupted with floods or shingle going on the road or anything like that.
I also think, so far as it being one of the country's finest seaside resorts, It will be enhanced by the extra safety on the promenades and by the extra beach which will be available for people to put their deck chairs on.
There haven't been many complaints. Yes, it did disturb a few people earlier on, but in general, people have been very, very supportive, and as it gets to completion, I hear nothing but good and a lot of congratulations to the borough.